What if the moment you thought your life was falling apart was actually the moment you were waking up? It doesn't come with fireworks. There's no revelation bathed in golden light. Often it begins on a quiet morning, the kind where the world outside looks exactly the same, but something inside you has gone completely still. You sit at your desk, stare at your inbox, check your calendar, but none of it touches you. The ambition that once lit a fire in your chest is gone. The goals you used to chase feel like echoes from a stranger's life. At first, you think it's just burnout. Maybe you need a break. But deep down, you sense something more profound has shifted, something sacred. You start to withdraw, not because you're giving up, but because the world you built no longer feels like home. The roles you played, the mask you wore to fit in, to succeed, to be loved, all begin to unravel. This isn't failure, it's a threshold, a sacred pause. And though it feels like everything is dissolving, what's really happening is this: the false self is dying and your soul, quiet, patient, ancient, is finally beginning to speak. Spiritual awakening isn't what most people imagine. It doesn't arrive with lightning bolts of purpose or radiant clarity that makes everything finally make sense. No, the truth is far more silent and far more sacred. For many, the moment of awakening doesn't feel like a beginning at all. It feels like an ending. You wake up one morning and the world hasn't changed, but you have. The things that used to drive you, emails, meetings, plans, performance, suddenly feel hollow. You're still playing the role, but your soul has already stepped off the stage. You smile in conversations, complete your tasks, even laugh at the right moments, but inside there's a quiet dissonance, a stillness that unsettles you. This isn't burnout. Burnout is loud, chaotic, and exhausted. What you feel is different. It's a strange sort of numbness, like your fire has dimmed, and you don't know why. You're not falling apart. You're dissolving. Carl Jung understood this moment long before it became a spiritual cliché. He saw that true awakening doesn't inflate the ego, it dismantles it. And with that dismantling comes confusion, grief, silence. You expected the heavens to open and your soul to soar, but instead something inside you grows quiet. What makes this stage so disorienting is that nothing external has changed. You still have your title, your routines, your roles. But the internal architecture, the psychological scaffolding that held up your identity, has started to collapse. You feel like you're floating untethered, unable to explain why things that once mattered now feel like shadows. This isn't failure. It's the beginning of the real journey, the start of individuation. When the soul reclaims its place from the ego, the first sign is almost always silence. A psychic pause. A withdrawal from the noise of life, not as an act of laziness or despair, but as an act of deeper listening. The silence is not empty. It is full of what you've been too busy to hear. And yes, it's terrifying. To lose the sense of purpose that once structured your life is to feel unmoored. You try to fix it, maybe another project, a new goal, a shift in direction. But none of it lands, because what's calling you isn't something new to achieve. It's something ancient to remember. What if the emptiness you fear is actually the doorway you've been avoiding? What if the stillness isn't a detour, but the path itself? This is where the old narratives begin to crack. The myth that your worth is in your productivity, that healing should feel like rising light, that awakening is a climb upward. No. Awakening begins when the climb loses meaning, when you sit down, unsure why you were climbing in the first place. And in that stillness, the soul begins to whisper, not with answers, but with invitations. What you're experiencing isn't the end. It's the unraveling of the performance. It's the return to presence. And though it feels like you're losing everything, what you're actually losing is everything that was never truly yours. At some point on the journey of awakening, you begin to feel as though you're no longer living your own life, but performing in one. You go through the motions. You check all the boxes. You say the right things, meet expectations, wear the face that fits the room. But deep down, something feels profoundly off. You begin to sense that much of what you've built wasn't truly built by you, but by the version of you who was trying to survive. Carl Jung called this version the persona, the social mask. We create to be accepted, to be safe, to belong. It's not a lie in the malicious sense. It's an adaptation, a role shaped by the reward and rejection systems of childhood. Be agreeable, be competent, be good, be strong. Over time, we become so good at playing the role, we forget it's a role at all. You become the achiever, the provider, the caretaker, the spiritual seeker, the peacemaker, and the world claps, the mask works. But something within you goes silent. You can no longer hear the voice beneath the applause. That's when the death of the false self begins. It doesn't feel like liberation. It feels like grief. You start to question the very things that once gave your life meaning, your job, your relationships, your goals. Not because they were bad, but because they were built around an identity that is now crumbling. You realize you've been climbing a mountain, but it's not yours. You've been performing a story, but it's not written by your soul. And that moment of realization hits like morning, not just for the time you've lost, but for the version of yourself you abandoned to keep the mask in place. This is not a breakdown. It is a breakthrough disguised as disintegration. The false self begins to dissolve not out of failure, but because it has served its purpose. It kept you alive. It helped you function. But now it has become too small for the person you're becoming, and like an old skin, it must be shed. But here's the paradox. While your outer world may still see success, your inner world feels hollow. The persona is still intact on the surface. You're still showing up, still saying, "I'm fine." But inside, the scaffolding is collapsing, and no one else sees it. That loneliness, that invisible collapse is part of the sacred undoing. You begin to crave silence, solitude, stillness. Not because you're broken, but because the noise of the false life is too loud. The soul doesn't speak in performance. It speaks in pause, in longing, in resonance. And so you enter a liminal space, no longer who you were, not yet who you are. The ego calls it death. The soul knows it as rebirth. You didn't fail. You evolved. The death of the false self isn't the end of you, it's the end of the act. What remains is the raw, unmasked essence of who you really are. Not the version designed to be liked, but the one who is free. And from that quiet place, your true life begins, not by rebuilding the old, but by listening for what wants to emerge from within. You were never taught to become yourself. You were taught to become liked. From a young age, you learned that certain parts of you were praised, while others were ignored or, worse, punished. So you adjusted. You smiled when you didn't feel like it. You suppressed the anger. You buried the confusion. You became whatever the moment required of you, and you wore that adaptation like armor, seamlessly, beautifully, convincingly. You didn't even notice the mask had fused to your face. Carl Jung named this mask the persona, the image of ourselves we present to the world, shaped not by soul, but by survival. It's not inherently false or evil. In fact, it's deeply functional. It helps us move through society, maintain relationships, pursue goals. But the danger comes when we forget that it is a mask, when we believe the performance is the person, when we confuse acceptance with authenticity. The persona is smart. It knows how to get applause. It knows how to keep you safe. It crafts an identity that earns belonging. The caretaker, the professional, the overachiever, the good one, the spiritual one. And while you're busy embodying these roles, your soul, the real you, waits patiently behind the curtain, uninvited, unseen. Eventually, something breaks. Not dramatically, but quietly. like a soft unraveling at the edge of the fabric. You start noticing it in small ways, a sudden disinterest in your work, a sense of disconnect in relationships, a longing for solitude that feels deeper than rest. You don't know why, but you feel like a stranger to your own life. This is the beginning of shedding the persona. It's terrifying, because the persona has been your currency. It's how you've moved through the world, how you've earned love, respect, approval. Without it, who are you? You try to hold it together. You go through the motions. But the threads are coming loose. The script doesn't land the same. The smile feels heavier. The mask, once light and seamless, now feels suffocating. You begin to ache not because something is wrong, but because something is waking up. Jung taught that shedding the persona is not a loss of identity, but a necessary step toward individuation, becoming your true self. But first, you must endure the disorientation that comes when the identity you've carefully constructed no longer fits. The ego fights back. It panics. It whispers, "This is who you are. Don't let go." But the soul knows better. It doesn't scream. It doesn't demand. It simply waits for silence, for stillness, for surrender. As the persona falls away, so do the structures built around it. The relationships that depended on your performance, the goals that were never truly yours, the routines that numbed you. And while the world may see this as a collapse, what's actually happening is sacred. You're returning home to yourself. It's not comfortable, it's not fast, but it's real. You begin to move from performance to presence, from being seen to being known, from doing what's expected to doing what resonates. And that shift, subtle but seismic, is the beginning of wholeness. Shedding the persona doesn't make you less. It reveals who you were before the world told you who to be. There is a strange and silent terrain that no one warns you about on the path of awakening. A space where everything familiar has dissolved, yet nothing new has taken its place. You are no longer who you were, but not yet who you are becoming. This is the in-between, a psychic hallway between stories. And it is as sacred as it is disorienting. At first, you may mistake it for depression. The fire is gone. The clarity is missing. You look around and nothing outwardly has changed. Same house, same job, same responsibilities. But within you, the architecture has collapsed. Your thoughts feel muffled. Your actions feel mechanical. The days pass and you feel like a ghost, haunting your own routine. You wake up, go through motions, but the meaning that once energized your life has slipped through your fingers like smoke. This is not failure. It's not dysfunction. It is metamorphosis. Carl Jung described this liminal phase as the dissolution of the old self. It mirrors the process of a caterpillar turning into liquid inside a cocoon. In that in-between space, there is no clear form, no recognizable identity. The psyche is not producing, it's restructuring. The soul is not lost, it's reorganizing itself from the inside out. But the ego doesn't understand this kind of pause. It panics. It craves movement, milestones, momentum. It screams for something to hold on to. It wants the next goal, the next label, the next ladder to climb. And when it doesn't find one, it spirals into self-doubt. What's wrong with me becomes the echo chamber of your inner world. Yet something deeper, quieter knows that this stillness is necessary, that in order to become who you really are, everything false must dissolve. And that process doesn't look like success. It looks like silence. It looks like rest. It looks like floating. You may find yourself craving solitude not because you're lonely, but because other people's energy feels overwhelming. You may forget things, lose interest in conversations, stare out the window for hours. You might cancel plans and feel like a failure for not being productive, when in truth your soul is doing the most productive work of all, undoing the layers that never truly belong to you. You are not being lazy. You are being stripped. The in-between is not a void, it is a sacred container, a space wide enough to hold everything you've been avoiding. Grief, old patterns, buried dreams, forgotten truths, they all surface here. Not to punish you, but to be witnessed, to be felt, to be healed. And though it can feel like nothing is happening, everything is. The unconscious is rising, the psyche is sorting, the self is gestating. You're not stuck, you're becoming. Jung called this the threshold of transformation. Not a destination, but a crossing. And though it offers no guarantees, no maps, no applause, it offers something greater, a return to truth. So, if you find yourself suspended between who you were and who you're meant to be, do not rush. Do not label this time as lost. Honor it. This is where the real journey begins, not forward, but inward. What happens when the very drive that once kept you alive begins to hollow you out? There comes a moment when everything you've used to propel yourself, ambition, deadlines, discipline, control suddenly stops working. The momentum dies down. The fire that once pushed you forward fades to an ember. You wake up and realize you no longer want to strive. You no longer want to chase. But more than that, you simply can't. Something inside you refuses to keep going. This isn't burnout. Not exactly. It's something more ancient, more sacred. Something Carl Jung described as enantiodromia, the psyche's natural law of reversal. When the pendulum has swung too far in one direction, the soul will eventually inevitably swing back. For years, maybe decades, you've been living in the extreme of productivity. You've pushed through exhaustion, measured your worth in metrics, attached your identity to success, performance, output. Hustle became holy. Rest felt like a sin. But underneath that constant movement was a deeper truth: you were running from something. Silence, stillness, yourself. And then without warning, the soul revolts. It doesn't ask for your permission. It doesn't schedule a meeting. One morning you simply stop, not by choice but by surrender. You stare at your to-do list and feel nothing. The old motivation vanishes. The urgency that once lit a fire under your feet has dissolved into dust. To those around you, it looks like laziness, like apathy, like failure. But within you, a sacred swing is unfolding. The psyche is reclaiming balance. The self is saying, enough. Enough pretending. Enough performing. Enough sacrificing presence for productivity. The sacred swing doesn't lead you into action, it draws you into stillness. And at first, this stillness feels unbearable. Your ego protests. It tells you to get up, get back, get over it. It shames you with whispers of inadequacy. You're wasting time, you're falling behind. You're not trying hard enough. But the soul is not here to try. It's here to be. And being requires unlearning everything the ego taught you. In this reversal, you begin to notice how much of your identity was tied to what you did, rather than who you are. You see how you chased success, not from passion, but from fear. Fear of not being enough, of being forgotten, of being unloved. And in the sacred swing, all of those fears rise to the surface, not to drown you, but to be witnessed, to be released. Slowly, a different kind of intelligence begins to awaken. One not fueled by pressure, but by resonance. A motivation that doesn't roar but whispers. You feel pulled, not pushed, moved, not managed. You begin to act not because you should, but because something inside you says yes. This is not regression. This is restoration. Not weakness, but wisdom. The pendulum must swing back not as punishment, but as healing. In stillness, your nervous system finds peace. Your creativity breathes again. Your essence returns. The self rises quietly from within. So if you find yourself tired in a way that sleep can't fix, if your soul has gone quiet, trust the reversal. Trust the sacred swing. You are not failing. You are finally freeing yourself from the grip of who you were and beginning the slow, beautiful return to who you truly are. In a world that glorifies movement, urgency, and relentless forward momentum, stillness is often mistaken for failure. But what if this stillness, the quiet withdrawal, the strange disinterest, the lack of fire was not the sign of a breakdown, but the beginning of a breakthrough? When the soul begins its healing, it rarely does so through noise. It doesn't announce its entrance with clarity or grand purpose. It arrives slowly beneath the surface in whispers, and before it can guide you forward, it first asks you to stop. You feel it when you wake up and stare blankly at your calendar, wondering why it all feels so meaningless. You notice it when your once passionate routines suddenly feel exhausting, even performative. You catch yourself craving solitude, not as a luxury, but as a necessity. This stillness doesn't come with answers. It comes with space. And in that space, everything you've been running from finally catches up. Carl Jung understood this moment well. He taught that much of what we call motivation is not drive, it's distraction. A way to avoid the deeper questions we are too afraid to ask. Who am I without the noise? Whose life am I actually living? When the ego collapses, when the roles, achievements, and identities you once clung to start to fall away, what's left is stillness. And that stillness, though terrifying, is sacred. It is a container wide enough to hold your grief, your unprocessed anger, your unmet needs, your forgotten self. At first, it feels unbearable. Like sitting inside a house after a storm has knocked the power out. Everything is quiet, no lights, no distraction, just you and what's inside you. The silence roars, the space echoes, and you wonder if something is wrong. But what's happening isn't dysfunction, it's repair. Your nervous system long overrun by pressure, and proving is finally finding its rhythm again. Your heart, once hardened by pace, is softening. Your mind, addicted to performance, is relearning presence. The world may call it laziness. Friends may worry. Colleagues may judge. But the soul doesn't measure worth in productivity. It measures it in presence. And the deeper you go into this quiet, the more clearly you begin to feel the pulse of what is true. Stillness is not stagnation. It's recalibration. You begin to feel tiny shifts, flickers of energy, not born from adrenaline, but from resonance. A desire to walk in nature, a dream that lingers, a forgotten song that suddenly moves you to tears. These are not random. They are soul whispers, gentle signals that you are healing not by force, but by surrender. And in time, a new motivation emerges. Not to climb higher, go faster, or do more, but to live honestly, to move from alignment, to act not from should, but from yes. The stillness didn't break you. It brought you home. So if you find yourself in the quiet, unsure, unmoved, honor it. You are not stuck. You are not broken. You are healing. You are remembering. And what comes next will not be powered by pressure, but by peace. This is what it means to come alive again, not through noise, but through truth. Nobody talks about the grief that comes when you're no longer willing or able to be the person you used to be. The world tells stories of transformation like they're clean breaks, victorious moments of becoming. But the truth, real transformation begins with mourning. Not just for what you've lost, but for who you no longer are. There's a moment in the awakening process where everything familiar still surrounds you, but none of it feels like you anymore. The job title still sits in your email signature. The routines are still in place. The people in your life haven't changed. But deep inside, something has shifted. The performance feels heavy. The roles feel foreign. The mask no longer fits. And what comes next isn't clarity. It's grief. Grief for the identity you carefully constructed. Grief for the dreams you once chased with fire in your chest, only to realize they were built on someone else's blueprint. Grief for the years you spent becoming who you thought you should be, rather than listening to who you are. Carl Jung knew this grief well. He spoke of it not as weakness, but as a threshold, a necessary passage, because before you can live from your soul, you must first let die the version of you that was built for approval. And death, even when symbolic, is never clean. It hits in waves. One morning you feel inspired, ready to begin again. The next you find yourself weeping in your car, not for any clear reason, but because a chapter of your life has ended and no one else seems to notice. You try to explain it, but the words fall flat. I just don't feel like myself anymore. I'm tired, but not physically. I don't know what I want, but I know it's not this. This grief is lonely, not because you're alone, but because what's dying is invisible. You're not grieving a breakup or a job loss or a move. You're grieving the story of yourself, and the world doesn't have rituals for that. So you create your own. You light a candle. You write a goodbye letter to the achiever, the peacemaker, the good girl, the strong one. You acknowledge what they gave you: stability, survival, structure. And then, with reverence, you begin to release them. Not with shame, not with anger, but with the sacred respect of someone who understands those identities were never meant to last forever. They were masks worn to navigate a world that didn't yet know how to hold your truth. Now you are learning to hold it yourself. Grieving the old identity doesn't mean rejecting your past. It means telling the truth about it. It means standing in the ruins and saying, "This version of me helped me survive, but I'm not here to survive anymore. I'm here to live." And that perhaps is the most courageous grief of all the grief that leads not to despair, but to rebirth. Because on the other side of letting go is not emptiness, but space. Space for something real, something rooted, something that no longer performs but simply is. So if you find yourself aching for no visible reason, crying over a life that others still admire, know this: you are not broken. You are grieving your way into wholeness. Once the mask falls, once the persona dissolves, and the old motivations no longer move you, something strange and sacred begins to emerge. At first it's quiet. So quiet, in fact, you almost miss it. But then slowly you feel it, a different kind of pull. Not a push, not a pressure, not a performance. A pull. Gentle, intuitive, unmistakable. You begin to sense that life is no longer asking you to strive, but to listen. This is the beginning of symbolic living, a way of life, not built from ambition or social script, but from soul. A life where action flows from resonance, not reputation, where your choices are guided not by what looks impressive, but by what feels honest. It's not about doing less. It's about doing what's real. Carl Jung spoke of this shift not as a rejection of responsibility, but as a return to alignment. He called it living symbolically, a way of inhabiting life from the inside out, where the unconscious isn't ignored or suppressed, but invited into the conversation, where the symbols of dreams, the whispers of the body, the echoes of the shadow all become part of your inner guidance system. You begin to pay attention to things others dismiss, a recurring dream, the ache in your chest when you say yes but mean no, the strange heaviness in certain rooms, the quiet joy when you're alone in nature, the inexplicable clarity that arrives in silence. These are not coincidences. They are signals, not from your ego, but from yourself, the deep, ancient core of you that has always known the way home. And from that place, a new kind of action is born. You start creating not to be seen, but because something inside you longs to be expressed. You say no, not to rebel, but to protect what is sacred within you. You walk away not out of fear, but because your soul has outgrown the space. These actions may look small from the outside, but on the inside they are monumental. They are declarations: I am no longer abandoning myself to be accepted by others. Symbolic living means you stop trying to fix the outer world to feel okay inside. Instead, You honor what's within and allow that to shape your path forward. It means listening to the body, trusting your dreams, welcoming discomfort as a message, not a problem. You begin to ask different questions. Not, what will people think, but what feels like truth in my bones. Not what's the smart move, but what brings me closer to myself. And the answers rarely come with clarity. They come with courage. This kind of life won't always be neat. It won't always make sense on paper. It may not win applause. But it will feel like home. Because it's no longer built to impress the world. It's built to reflect your soul. Symbolic living doesn't mean walking away from life. It means entering it fully, not as the version of you others want, but as the person you were always meant to be. Whole, honest, aligned. And in that space, your life becomes not just something you manage, but something you embody. There comes a point in every soul's journey where the silence grows so loud, you can no longer ignore what's been buried beneath your becoming. You've removed the mask. You've stepped away from the persona. You've stopped performing the life you thought you were supposed to live. And now, in the quiet aftermath, something ancient begins to stir. It isn't light. It isn't clarity. It's not joy or liberation. It's shadow. Carl Jung taught that the shadow is the part of ourselves we exile in order to be loved, the rage we suppress to be good, the grief we hid to be strong, the longing we silence to be productive. These fragments of self don't disappear. They simply go underground, waiting sometimes for decades for a safe enough space to resurface. And that space is stillness. When your ego collapses and your soul begins to lead, the shadow rises not to punish you but to rejoin you, not to shame you but to be seen. The sadness you can't explain, the resentment that simmers beneath the surface, the fear of being vulnerable. These are not flaws. They are unprocessed truths knocking gently at the door of your awareness. But the shadow does not speak in logic. It speaks in feeling, in resistance, in discomfort. It shows up in the patterns you can't break, the relationships that mirror your deepest wounds, the self-sabotage you can't seem to stop. And the invitation is not to fight it, but to face it. This is where real healing begins, not in transcendence, but in integration. You meet the abandoned parts of you with compassion, not judgment. You let yourself feel the anger you were taught to fear. You hold space for the grief you were told to suppress. You tell the truth about what hurt you, about how you had to twist yourself to belong, about the dreams you buried to make others comfortable, and slowly the shadow begins to soften. Not because it disappears, but because it's finally allowed to exist. It becomes part of you again. Not as something to fix, but as something to understand. The same energy you once used to hide from yourself now becomes the force that grounds your truth. This process isn't easy. It's raw, it's sacred, and it's deeply misunderstood. Because our culture teaches us to strive for light, to seek happiness, to escape the dark. But Jung knew the truth that we don't become whole by ascending. We become whole by descending, by walking willingly into the parts of ourselves we were taught to fear. And in doing so, we remember we were never broken. We were only fragmented. Shadow integration is not about becoming perfect. It's about becoming honest. It's about ending the war within. No longer splitting yourself into acceptable and unacceptable pieces, but embracing your full humanity as it is. And when you do, a different kind of peace arrives. Not the kind that comes from avoidance, but the kind that comes from reunion. Your inner world becomes less divided. Your choices become more aligned. You begin to trust yourself, not because you've mastered control, but because you've made peace with your depth. This is the gift of the shadow. It returns you to yourself. Fully, powerfully, unapologetically. After the silence, after the surrender, after the long and uncertain descent into the shadow, you begin to feel something stir. Not a blaze, not a breakthrough, but a flicker, a whisper, a gentle nudge from within that says, "It's time." This is the return of motivation, but not the kind you once knew. You're not running anymore. Not from your past, not from yourself, not from the aching silence that used to terrify you. For the first time, your movement is not driven by fear of falling behind, or by the insatiable need to prove your worth. You're no longer fueled by adrenaline or expectation. You're no longer performing. You're responding. Carl Jung called this shift the emergence of the self, the part of you that lives beyond identity, beyond image, beyond ego. And when the self begins to lead, motivation arises from an entirely different place. It's not loud. It's not urgent. It doesn't come with bullet points, 5-year plans, or external validation. It arrives in the form of resonance. You feel drawn, not pushed, called, not chased, inspired, not obligated. And what you're drawn to may surprise you. It may not look productive or strategic. You may suddenly feel called to garden, to sketch symbols, to write poetry that no one will read. You may cancel old commitments, step away from what once impressed people, or spend long afternoons doing absolutely nothing, and yet feel more alive than you did in years of non-stop doing. Because now you're not operating from the mask. You're moving from the core. This new kind of motivation doesn't roar, it hums. It's steady. It's quiet. It waits for your presence, not your performance. And that's how you know it's real. You begin to make choices from alignment instead of anxiety. You say yes only when it echoes something deep and unspoken in you. You say no, not out of defiance, but from devotion to your truth, your peace, your energy. You create not to get ahead, but because something inside you is overflowing and needs somewhere to pour. This is not the life you once built. This is the life that is building you. And though it may look smaller from the outside, less curated, less linear, less decorated, it feels truer. Your motivation no longer bends to the market. It bends to the moment, to the feeling in your gut, to the whisper in your soul, to the quiet yes that asks nothing in return. In this space, you don't wait for permission, you don't seek applause, you don't chase clarity, you follow aliveness. And the irony is when you stop trying to impress, your presence becomes magnetic. Not because you're louder, but because you're rooted. People feel the difference. So do you. You didn't lose your drive. You outgrew the illusion that it had to hurt to matter, that it had to cost your peace to be meaningful, that it had to look impressive to be real. This is what real motivation feels like, a soft, steady current that flows not from scarcity but from truth. And once you touch that current, there is no going back. There comes a point on the healing path where the chaos quiets, the striving settles, the shadow no longer scares you, and the mask you once wore so well lies at your feet, no longer needed, no longer missed. At first, this space feels unfamiliar. You look around and realize you are no longer chasing an identity or a role or a life that isn't yours. There is no applause, no spotlight, just you. Raw, honest, undeniably real. And in that stillness, something sacred happens. You begin to come home to yourself, not the self shaped by expectation, by culture, by wounded patterns and survival mechanisms. Not the version of you who adapted to be loved, who hustled to be accepted, who conformed to feel safe. But the self that has been patiently waiting beneath the noise, beneath the stories, beneath the fear. The true self, the one who remembers. Carl Jung taught that the process of individuation, the journey toward wholeness, is not about becoming someone new. It's about removing everything that is not you until all that remains is the truth, the essence, the soul. And this homecoming doesn't feel like fireworks or grand revelations. It feels like relief, like breathing for the first time, like sitting in your own skin without flinching, like speaking without rehearsing, like loving without performing. It feels like peace, not because everything is perfect, but because everything is yours. You're no longer contorting yourself to fit into rooms where you shrink. You're no longer running from your own reflection. You're no longer negotiating with your intuition for the sake of being liked. You simply are, and that is enough. Coming home to yourself means you stop asking, who do they want me to be, and start asking, what feels true in my bones? You stop chasing clarity in others' opinions and start trusting the compass inside your chest. You set boundaries, not as punishment, but as sacred lines that protect your peace. You choose alignment over approval, depth over performance, wholeness over perfection. And yes, it's quieter here, but it's not lonely. It's spacious. You begin to notice beauty in the ordinary, meaning in the mundane. A walk in nature feels like a sermon. A breath feels like a prayer. You are no longer waiting for a big moment to define you. You're no longer outsourcing your worth. You are living fully from the inside out. This is the paradox. When you stop trying to prove yourself, you become magnetic. Not because you're louder, but because you're real. Not because you're perfect, but because you're whole. You didn't need to become someone else to be worthy. You just needed to remember who you were beneath the forgetting. And now you've come home not to a house or a label or a role, but to a feeling, a knowing, a grounded truth that says this is me, and this is enough. So if you've walked through the fire, if you've lost your way, if you've dismantled the persona and danced with the shadow, know this: you are not returning to who you were. You are arriving in who you've always been. This is not the end. This is the beginning of living soul first. And that, Jung would say, is the moment you finally become whole. In a world that constantly pushes us to be more, do more, prove more, the greatest act of courage may be the choice to slow down and listen, to stop performing for approval and start living from alignment. The real lesson isn't about escaping pain or chasing perfection. It's about learning to sit with yourself when everything familiar has fallen away. It's about recognizing that the emptiness you fear is often the space where your soul finally has room to speak. We're taught to fear stillness, to see it as weakness, stagnation, or failure. But what if stillness is where you actually heal? What if the collapse of who you were is the gateway to who you really are? The message is simple but radical. You don't need to earn your worth. You don't have to fix yourself to be lovable. And you don't need to be loud to be powerful. Your truest life won't come from playing a role. It will come from honoring your inner truth, even if no one else understands it yet. The journey home isn't upward, it's inward. And sometimes the most transformative thing you can do is to stop running and simply be.